All right, everyone. Welcome to Tech Tuesday, brought to you by the Tech Titan Cybersecurity Forum. My name is Jackson Koo, and I work for AT&T Labs. I'm one of the Cybersecurity Forum tri-chairs and plan these webinars. We have a great speaker today who will be sharing with you about the Edward Snowden's case from his personal experience. The Tech Tuesday events are produced by our forums on the second and fourth Tuesdays of each month. Tech Tuesdays, luncheons, and awards gala are part of Tech Titan's commitment to being a champion of the North Texas tech community. We will be holding a brief networking session for those who are wanting to meet new people or be new acquaintances. Would you please wait for the quick instruction after the program concludes and remain on Zoom to participate. We should begin the networking session around 1 o'clock Dallas time and will adjourn around 1:20. If you wish to ask a question, please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. The question will be asked on your behalf after our keynote concludes his presentation. Edward Snowden was the quintessential insider threat that all organizations feared. We're about to hear the inside story of Snowden's last few months at the National Security Agency. The search for him, the impact of his action from his then boss, Stephen Bay. Stephen Bay is the Cybersecurity Operations Consulting Lead at Kudelski Security. With 20 years in cybersecurity, his career has spanned government, enterprise, and consulting services. He served as an analyst supporting the NSA through the US Air Force and federal contracting for much of his career. He served as Edward Snowden's boss just before Snowden's flight from the United States. Stephen designed and implemented information security programs for Fortune 500 companies, served as a CISO, and provided extensive cybersecurity consulting services. He holds an MBA from the Thunderbird School of Global Management and an MA in International Relations from Webster University. Please welcome Stephen Bay.
Thank you, Jackson. Sure appreciate you guys having me, and thrilled to be here to be able to share my story with you and hopefully some lessons learned. It's a really interesting story. I hope you enjoy it. And I really hope as we walk away, as we conclude today, that you'll have one or two ideas that you can take back to your organization about how do we better prepare to defend ourselves against insider threat, right? So the focus of the conversation is going to be fairly heavily around more of the application of the business. I'm going to talk about the story and everything, and less on was Snowden a hero or wasn't he a hero? And we'll touch on those sorts of things a little bit. But for the most part, I'm hoping that you'll come away with from our conversation with a better understanding of insider threats and how to protect yourself from it. So to that end, let's start out by talking about insider threats. Insider threats are rapidly increasing. I've done some studies, I wouldn't call them scientific studies, but studies in terms of research about 6 months ago, looking at kind of comparing reports of insider threat activity in the last few years over a period of time. And I've seen more articles and more arrests and indictments, et cetera, of individuals being arrested or charged or otherwise having fled the country and later being charged for spying on, or not spying, but stealing information property from companies in the United States and taking them to either a foreign country to help build the similar business there, or to provide it to a company located there, or in a corporate espionage sense, right? So the competition for information and the competition between businesses is very real. And the competition between nation states. When we talk about these big, large global nation states, whether that's the United States, China, Russia, and other nation states, there's competition in that regard, right? And we hear articles all the time about individuals being arrested for taking data to those places. In fact, there's one story that I read, I think it happened in early 2020, maybe it was late 2019, where an individual working for a tech company in Connecticut had been arrested about a month before he was ready to flee to China and start the exact same version of the company he worked for there, right? So now he wasn't necessarily stealing it on behalf of a company that already existed, or necessarily to go give it to a certain government, but to start a similar company and take all the intellectual property and do it maybe at a cheaper rate, right? So those sorts of things are increasing, and they really put our various organizations at risk. And this could be ranging from the example that I just gave to those who are stealing trade secrets, as you see in that kind of last headline there on the left, where Tesla goes after Facebook for trade secret theft, and Apple went after them as well, right? So this is a very real threat. Another insider threat that we often think about are financial fraud, right? So people who use their insider data for insider trading in the stock market, I think that counts as an insider threat, even though it may not harm a particular company per se, but it's certainly insider activity. Or people who are facing in an organization, maybe they have too much debt, they got a mortgage that's too high, or maybe they've just kind of suffered from an excessive bout of greed where they just want more money, or they feel underappreciated and they want to obtain anything that they deserve, or that the company owes them more, right? They may do things to steal money from the organization or steal intellectual property. And these sorts of things happen often. And what the scary thing about insider threats is that insiders, because they know the organization, often do the most harm, right? The biggest damage to NSA in its history from any sort of data breach hasn't been because of hackers hacking NSA. It's because of Snowden or similar folks in the past who have stolen data from the agency, for right or wrong, regardless of what one thinks about what Snowden did or didn't do, or anybody else. The reality is it did immense damage to that organization, right? Now, another type of insiders that I think really gets overlooked, as we as organizations, companies, education, maybe you work for a university or whatever it is that you're tied to. When we think of insider threats, we often think of people who have malicious intent and people who really want to do harm. But the reality is even though they may not do overall as much damage as a malicious insider who's really motivated, a majority of your data breaches come from trusted insiders, people like you and me, who have no malicious intent at all, who maybe aren't as familiar with how to identify a phishing email, or maybe aren't browsing the internet very effectively or very securely. And we click on that link, or we open up that email attachment, or we inadvertently click on that email that asks us to go put our personal information into a bank account website, thinking it's our bank account. Those are insider threat risks that need to be addressed in organizations. And some of these, and there are some very major data breaches that have occurred through phishing. Or what's called whaling. I want to highlight that bottom corner one, FACC. This is a German company who their executives had fallen victim to whaling. If you're not familiar with the term whaling, it's like phishing, but it involves your executives. In which case, the CFO had received a text message or email from allegedly from the CEO asking him to transfer, I think it was $50 million to a bank account for a customer immediately, right? And because there were no controls and no checks in place, the CFO didn't question that it may not have come from the CEO and processed it. And for this company, it wiped out all of their profit for the entire year, and they almost went under. And they fortunately survived it, but it did immense damage to their organization. So the point is that insiders are a very real threat, but it's not only malicious folks, it can also be you and I. So it's incumbent upon each of us to continue to be diligent and vigilant in learning how to identify phishing emails, that we're not browsing sketchy websites on our work computers or from our work network or anything like that, right? That we're doing things to protect the environment, protect the organization from data loss. So hopefully that kind of lays the groundwork. And let me roll now into Edward Snowden's story. So for those of you who may not be as familiar with Edward Snowden, just a very brief overview. Edward Snowden was a career IT administrator at both the CIA and NSA. I hired him in March, he started with me in April of 2013, April 1st, 2013. And he ended up fleeing the country with 1.7 million documents taken from NSA's top secret network to Hong Kong. And there he gave those documents to the media, some reporters, and those reporters then published articles stating that NSA was doing a variety of unsavory things, with the implication or the allegation that NSA was spying on Americans. And we'll dive more into that in a little bit. So after being in Hong Kong for about a month and a half, he's trying to get to Europe or to Ecuador. He ends up in the Russian airport. He gets stuck in the Russian international section for about a month. And then Russia ultimately gives him asylum, and he's been in Russia ever since. And so Snowden's stated motivation for what he did, right? He didn't just wake up and do this on a whim. Snowden, being an IT administrator working at NSA, was also very into privacy, and it's one of his hobbies. And one of the things he took very seriously was privacy, the Fourth Amendment, and he was concerned about government overreach. And we'd have conversations just on the side about those issues occasionally, where we talk about cybersecurity, we talk about privacy, and those sorts of things, right? So it was very close. It was very important to him. And he viewed what he felt to be abuses perpetrated on the American people by the U.S. government, and that those abuses needed to be exposed. And so he took it upon himself to do that, and took that with 1.7 million plus documents, and ended up, like I mentioned, releasing them to the world. So now, to share with you kind of my story with him, I mentioned to you, and what we're going to do is we talk about this briefly. I'm going to touch on a couple of lessons we learned about how insiders operate, and maybe some things we can do to protect ourselves as we go throughout this conversation. So as I mentioned, I hired Snowden on April 1st, 2013. And I had my job interview with him about a month and a half later. We'd gone back and forth about whether or not to hire him. The position I ended up putting him in was a position in which I needed a kind of a unicorn at NSA Hawaii. So I was the site lead for my company's NSA Hawaii business. And I needed to find a person who had a top secret security clearance with the appropriate polygraphs having been done. I needed someone who was very, very technical, understood network technologies very well, how the internet works and how to navigate their way through the internet. And I needed somebody who understood the cyber threat. And I guess tied to that, those two kind of tied together. Understood the cyber threat, how the hackers operated, et cetera. And also I needed somebody who was a trained intelligence analyst. And that third one is where Snowden was lacking. And that's one of the big misconceptions that's out there about Snowden, is that he wasn't an intelligence analyst. He was a career IT systems administrator. And this is actually a valuable lessons learned that we'll touch on a little bit, is this transition from working on the IT side to working on the intelligence side, and a control failure that happened there. But suffice it to say, for the purposes of where we're at right now in the conversation, is that he didn't understand how NSA used and collected data that it collected across the globe, and what it was doing to protect, to ensure that they weren't spying on Americans, right? And that's not to say there weren't mistakes, that there weren't abuses done by NSA, but I can say with quite a bit of assurance and confidence that the extent to which those abuses occurred were nothing near to the level to which Snowden claimed them to be. But anyhow, after I hired Snowden, we worked together. He's doing a good job for the customer, even though he didn't have that trained intelligence analysis experience. His cybersecurity experience, his tech experience, and the clearance made him kind of a no-brainer to go into this position and make him work there. And the client that we were contractors, we were working for government entities. We had a team lead we were reporting to. They were happy with the work he was doing. He picked up intelligence analysts very quickly. He's a very, very intelligent person. He was even training after about 2 weeks of on the job. He was starting to train a lot of junior military folks who were on his team on how to be intelligence analysts, and particularly more about the technology and about hackers and about how different nation states conducted cybersecurity operations. And so he was doing a good job with that. Now, shortly after, maybe about 3 or 4 weeks after starting with my team, Ed came to my desk and he said, "Hey, Steve, I need to talk to you about something. It's unfortunate because I know I'm brand new here and I hate being that guy that causes problems being a new employee. But I have epilepsy and I've had it under control for a really long time. But for whatever reason, the last month and a half or so, it's starting to flare up and I've begun to have more problems with it. And it's not the kind of epilepsy in which I start having seizures. I more kind of will just black out wherever I am. And so it's been causing a lot of problems. And so I've got some doctor appointments scheduled over the next couple of weeks to get checked out. So I just want to let you know that I'm going to be coming into work late occasionally so that I can go to these doctor's appointments. So what Snowden was doing here, and this is something we see pretty consistently with insider threats, is when they need to change their behaviors in order to execute their plan, they need to build some sort of reasoning or excuse behind it, right? So what he was doing was using epilepsy. He begins to allow himself to start violating NSA policies and procedures because through this story. So what he did is by having to go to medical appointments at, let's say, 10 a.m. Maybe the appointment's at 10 a.m. He's there for a couple hours. Maybe he shows up to work at 12:30 or 1. He still needs to work a full day. So he's now working from, say, 1 p.m. to, say, 8 or 9 p.m. And like any other organization on Earth, you know, the agency was a ghost town except for a handful of offices after 5:30 or 6 p.m. So what this allowed him to do was to work in an office without any prying eyes or anybody around him and begin to download data for 2 or 3 hours a night for the nights that he was there. And now, one of the big control failures NSA had is, like, if you've worked with the government in any sense, whether it was the military or other government entities, they have a general rule that says thou shalt not use thumb drives, right? Well, unfortunately, this policy was not enforced, and Snowden was able to download these 1.7 million documents onto a thumb drive. And had he tried to take that thumb drive and plug it into his computer during a normal working hours, somebody would have noticed and somebody would have called him out on it. And so he needed to enable himself to have access to the computers, to the networks without other people around. We worked in an open workspace environment. We weren't in cubicles. And so it would have been very difficult to hide what he was doing with people around. So Epilepsy gave him that out. Now, what Epilepsy also did is it allowed him to build his escape plan. NSA also has a policy around security in which if you can't just not show up to work, right? It's not like a civilian job like I've got now where I don't show up to work for a day. Maybe somebody notices, maybe somebody doesn't, maybe the day after, you know, the second day I don't show up, somebody calls me and says, hey, are you all right? Is everything cool? And they kind of start wondering, and that sort of thing. No, NSA and a lot of highly secure environments, if you don't show up for work by noon, they're calling up security and they're starting to look for you, right? So had Snowden not had some sort of escape plan and just disappeared, we would have been looking for him immediately. But what Epilepsy allowed him to do was to go on short-term leave, right? And so that's exactly what ended up happening. So about 3 or 4 weeks after he comes to me with the Epilepsy story, he then comes and says, hey, the Epilepsy continues to get bad. It's worse than ever. This is a Friday. And he says, next Monday and Tuesday, unfortunately, I'm going to have to the doctors want me in medical appointments all day. So they're doing tests all day Monday, all day Tuesday. And if those tests go bad, I'm going to have to go on medical leave. Well, sure enough, the tests go bad. He informs me that he needed that he was going to be out for a couple of weeks, maybe a month, and that, you know, hopefully in a month or two, he'll be back in. He'll keep me informed. So I offer him my support. We try to get him on short-term disability, but after this series of emails occurs, he never responds to anything. And it turns out, looking back in hindsight, that last email I received from him was on May 22nd, and it was or May 23rd, it was a Wednesday night. And he had actually already flown to Hawaii on May 20th, on Sunday, May 20th, not to Hawaii, I mean to Hong Kong. And so now what he was doing in Hong Kong was just wrapping up loose ends. So over the next couple of weeks, timesheets are due. I've got HR stuff to do to make sure he's getting paid for short-term disability, and also just to make sure we're documenting his absence. He's not responding to any phone calls, any text messages, or anything like that. So I call my boss at the end of May and ask him to reach out to, or ask him for guidance on what to do. He reaches out to NSA Security and it says, hey, we've got a guy on medical leave. So we kind of know that there's something going on, but we want you to know he hasn't been heard from for 2 weeks. And that kind of saved our bacon in many respects, right? By my boss taking that action. So that next Monday, the first Monday of June 2013, I got a call from NSA Security, and they asked me, they said, hey, we hear you got a guy missing. We're going to help you. We want to help you look for him. You know, we don't normally get involved in these sorts of security, of healthcare related issues, but no, we're a really small, close-knit family here in Hawaii, and we want to help you look for him. So I spent much of that next week looking for Snowden. So I'm hanging out with some of these NSA security guys from time to time. We went by his house, we went by his girlfriend's place, we went by places from which he was known to congregate and hang out. And again, it was crickets. Now, in my mind, going through this, I figure the most likely scenario is that Ed had gone back to Maryland to be with his family to recover, and it was just went off the grid for a little bit, right? The fear that I had, maybe perhaps somewhat irrational, the fear that I had was that Ed had ignored doctor's orders and was decided to go on a drive along some cliff road in Hawaii. He had an epileptic episode and maybe ended up crashed or dead or lost somewhere, and nobody had been able to find him. So it was in the middle of this week, this article that you see on the screen hit the news. And in this particular article, it talks about how the US collects private data from various technologies, some of which we don't use anymore, but are still around today. And then within the course of the article, it talks about how NSA was spying on Americans using these things, which I heavily debate and disagreed with, and many of us at the agency felt the same way, right? When this article hit, and there were two others that same week, where we had no idea where it came from, it really sent shockwaves to the agency, and we felt like it was there were a lot of misconceptions, a lot of untruths within these articles, and things that we were frustrated that we couldn't go out and refute because of the classified nature of our jobs. So later that week, after these three articles have come out, it still never crosses my mind that Ed is the guy behind this, right? I'm hanging out with one of my buddies on Saturday at some church event or whatever we were doing, and we happened to work together. So not only do we go to church together, we're really close friends, but we work together, and I was kind of telling about my crazy week, and a bunch of personal stuff had gone on. I actually was on PTO most of that week. And I was kind of telling this whole story and about Ed, and I mentioned Ed and how we were looking for him. And, I'm worried that he's dead somewhere. And my buddy stops me and he says, "Hey, Steve, wouldn't it be crazy if Ed were the guy leaking all this stuff?" And at that moment, my mind kind of blew up. And I was like, there's no way Ed would do something like that. But man, if he did, it would be my absolute worst nightmare. Well, sure enough, the next morning is June 9th, 2013. Probably the worst day of my life, or at least the worst day of my professional life. I was in a church leadership meeting, and I come out of my meeting at 10 a.m. Hawaii time, and I look at my phone, and my phone had blown up with missed phone calls and text messages from a variety of people, my boss, people at NSA that I worked with, people in my company. But it just so happened that the first text that I saw happened to be from my friend from the day before. And all it said was something like, "Hey man, looks like your worst nightmare came true. I'm sorry." And I knew exactly what he meant. And I went into an empty room in the church and I melted down, crying my eyes out, just freaking out, panic, like you wouldn't believe. Every sort of irrational thought one could have kind of fell on me at that time, whether it was, me losing my job or having to go to jail, like I was gonna be blamed for it or something, even though I had nothing to do with it, or up to where maybe we're going to lose all of because of Snowden and my employee, NSA is going to lose all their collection assets, national security is going to be compromised, terrorists are going to run wild, and China's going to take over the world. All of these things occur, and they begin to fall on my shoulders, right? So kind of throughout that day, it starts out at panic, but you get to the point when you hit these sort of crisis experiences. And any of you have dealt with any major crisis in your life probably know this, where at some point you have to suck it up and you have to act. And that's what it came to with me. So I took the time to call all my 15 employees, discussed it with them. Some people were really distraught. Some people barely knew them and were just blown away by it, right? But ultimately, we kind of worked through it. And the next day I had to go into work, face the music. And to wrap up kind of the story, and I'm paraphrasing a fair amount here just for the sake of time, but as I kind of was panicking over this and discussing these issues and trying to do kind of crisis management through all of this, I was visiting with the director of NSA Hawaii, who was an admiral, the next day, Monday. And he really put it best. He said, Steve, Ed had been planning this for a very, very long time. And he that he was going to do this regardless of who he worked for or who was his boss. The reality is you got caught holding the hot potato when time ran out. And once I heard that, I knew everything was generally going to be okay, right? And so as we think about the Snowden experience, and it did immense damage to the intelligence community, cost billions upon billions of dollars to recover of taxpayer dollars for the agency to recover. Because not only did the NSA have to change a lot of the way that they operated, but so did CIA and a lot of our other military intelligence apparatus based upon the things that he stole and took. And so all those things had to be changed. So So it did immense damage. So in thinking about now Ed's insider threat profile, I'm not going to touch on this too much for the sake of time, but I just want to highlight that insiders all generally have a common traits, right? There's a motivating purpose. Many of them are narcissistic. They come up with excuses for abnormal behaviors. Snowden used epilepsy as his story, as his way to get past, to avoid detection. There's also some sort of external influence, right? There's a family member, there's some sort of crisis going on in life, whatever it may be. And then interestingly, in all the insider threat stories that I've ever kind of researched, even people who are really non-technical to become non-insider, can become insider threats and do damage intentionally, magically become technology experts. And they exploit a variety of technologies in order to execute what it is they're trying to do. So what was it that failed to prevent his detection? So these are some lessons we can learn. So one, there were IT security failures, right? How come when a thumb drive was plugged into the box, didn't an alarm go off in their SOC? Or why was it allowed to work in the first place, right? There were also issues with, from an IT security standpoint, with organization separation of duties, where Snowden worked for the IT department, for his whole career, and then on a Friday left IT, and on a Monday joined my team in intelligence. Well, like any organization, you have specific privileges that are allocated to each role, right? So Snowden admitted that he specifically targeted my position in order to get access to intelligence data. Now, it seems likely that the agency didn't remove his his system administrative privileges when he left the IT department and went to the Intel department. So when he got to the Intel side for maybe a couple of days, maybe a week or more, he may have had the keys to the kingdom. We had all the accesses to the Intel side, plus all the systems administrative rights, which allowed him to download a lot of data. There's also a failure in policy enforcement, right? There are things like, again, going back to the thumb drive. They had a policy that said you can't use a thumb drive, yet he was able to use it. That policy was not enforced. And so that's a big area where organizations can really do a lot to protect themselves, is to enforce those policies. Policies are only as good as the paper they're written on unless they're enforced. He also conducted social engineering. There was an Air Force airman that he socially engineered to have him, when this airman went on leave, he was able to acquire that person's username and password, and that was used to gather intelligence information that Snowden took with him to Hong Kong. And then there are also failures in cross-organizational communications, where Snowden was an employee of CIA, and his security clearance was flagged by the CIA, but as NSA was doing their security clearance background check, that information never got communicated to NSA. And had that simple element, had that flag been identified by NSA in their background check, it's likely Snowden never would have been admitted into the agency in the first place and would have been able to defeat it. To wrap things up, I just want to quickly highlight strategies for improving your security, right? Stopping a determined threat actor, an insider threat, can be very, very difficult. But if you focus on a healthy culture, we want to have strong insider threat monitoring and technology solutions that are monitoring our people, but not monitoring from a what are they doing in babysitting standpoint, but more of a are there other behaviors occurring that are anomalous and that may be dangerous. But we want to create a culture of trust and a culture of where people want to work. If people enjoy their job and they're happy with where they're at, they're less likely to do malicious insider things. You also want to employ an insider threat program, right? You want to have a program in place that has technology, processes, and the right people that covers not just information and information loss from insiders, but also maybe physical security threats, right? YouTube had a physical attack, and I think it was 2017 a shooting on their campus from a disgruntled employee. We talked about enforcing policies, and you also want security monitoring and data loss prevention. There are technologies out there that can help decrease the likelihood that data can be taken off the network. Had a DLP type solution been in place when Snowden was working, it's unlikely he would have been able to download that as much data as he did. And then finally, invest in training and train your people. The more that your people know how to identify suspicious activity, but even more importantly, train your people on phishing and on secure web browsing and cybersecurity overall. And if they could, the more that they know how to identify a bad email from a good email, or even just to trust their gut when they see it, the more secure you're going to be. So some of these strategies go a long way to helping you identify insider threats, hopefully preventative measures to prevent insider threats from occurring, and also can help you in your response to if an insider threat attack occurs to be able to respond to it. So I'm going to stop there for the sake of time. Thank you for your attention. I hope this is interesting to you. And I know we have some time now for questions and answers. I'd love to be able to answer any questions you have, whether about Snowden or about insider threats or anything else it may be. If it's okay, I'm going to go off of screen share. We can talk face to face, if that's all right.
Hey, Stephen, we have a question from Jackson actually, but
yeah.
Do you see Edward Snowden as a patriot?
Personally, no, I don't. I understand the argument for it. I understand how people view him in that way, right? But you know, forgive me for I'm going to pontificate for a little bit, or just maybe kind of expand my answer. I'll try to speak too long. I can be verbose at times. Through this experience, you know, I'm a very opinionated person, and I was one of those guys pre-Snowden that I would kind of get in arguments about politics or international issues on like Facebook or whatever, right? I was kind of that guy. And then I realized that after having gone through this global crisis and been on the inside and known really what was occurring, that people on the outside really don't know. They know what they know, right? The media doesn't know as much as they think they know. And certainly the average lay person isn't as expert in what they're claiming to be experts in, right? The amount of misinformation that was out there about Snowden was amazing. And it really opened my eyes into how much we really know about various crises. So for example, you know, Snowden's stated motivation was that, going back, I see abuses being perpetrated on the American people by the U.S. government, by the National Security Agency, and I need to reveal that, right? Had Snowden only exposed information specifically related to that, those abuses, I would be much, much more sympathetic. And I'd probably be, I maybe wouldn't view him as, quote, a hero or anything, but maybe as a patriot and maybe in a positive light. But I went through every media reporter, every leak, basically, every document that he released in 2013. I went through every one of them for that year. I think there was like 67 of them, give or take, right? And there wasn't a single document that was released out to their media that specifically claimed in the actual raw data itself that NSA was spying on people. Now, there were technologies and there were things that could have been used to spy on Americans, right? Like go back to that article that was hit, right? If NSA has accesses to collect intelligence from Google and from Skype and from all these Facebook or whatever, well, we use those technologies, but so do hackers and so do weapons proliferators and so do terrorists, right? So the question is, and this is where Snowden, I think, got it completely wrong, is he didn't talk about any of the oversight and compliance that was in place to protect that, to ensure that we, because I had access to those programs, that we as intelligence analysts weren't spying on Americans, that we were using that for specific missions that we were targeted with. But a vast majority of the intelligence data that was released out to the media from Snowden's leaks were legitimate and legal foreign intelligence capability, right? That were fully in line with the charter that NSA has given and is fully legal and approved by it. It had nothing to do with anything remotely domestic. Things like NSA had hacked 400 computers in China. That has nothing to do with us spying on Americans. That's a very real national security issue, right? So that sort of thing is where, had Snowden only released stuff specifically pertaining to domestic collection and domestic law breaking, I would be much more sympathetic. But the fact is he leaked the vast majority of the data, 95% plus, was legitimate legal foreign intelligence.
Right. John Allen asked, what was the fallout to you personally?
Yeah, good question.
As a result of the Snowden issue.
So for the first month and a half, it was fine, right? I mean, there were people that were upset at our team, upset at my company, wanted us kicked out, so on and so forth. But nobody really blamed me. And nobody still does blame me, right? But I figured something this big, I was waiting for the other shoe to drop, right? I figured that Congress was going to have to be able to tell the American people something. And so that we took action. And I figured the guy who hired him was going to be the guy to get fired. Well, there was one interaction I had with Snowden where he kind of socially engineered me, and I gave him a piece of intelligence that he wasn't authorized to have access to. Now, it pertained directly to his job, and I didn't give him the really sensitive stuff. It was just a bunch of text. But it was enough that when I went in to meet with FBI about it, it was enough to say, look, they even agreed this wasn't that big of a deal. But the fact of how sensitive the Snowden thing is, we need to temporarily remove your access to the agency. So they didn't take my clearance away, but I was removed from the agency. And because I was a contractor and you have to be billable and utilized, if you guys have ever been on that side of the house with consulting or whatever, Booz Allen kept me on for about another 2.5 months. And then they basically got to the point where, look, if you can't have another job within the company, we're going to have to let you go. And so I was about 2 weeks away from moving to my grandparents' basement in Salt Lake City and from Hawaii when a big financial company got hacked, and Booz Allen was brought in to do the IR. And so I went over to the commercial side and did the IR on that and went over into commercial consulting. And so it was a very difficult and stressful time. I do wish I was still in intelligence, but that was a big issue. And then the other impact it had on me, and I won't dive too much into it, it had pretty profound impacts on my relationship with my wife, my marriage, and things like that we have worked through since then, but certainly caused some pain over the years. So.
Yeah, as that kind of stress would do.
Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely.
Solomon Israel asked, was Snowden performing ongoing espionage, or was it a one-time event? And if it was a one-time event, does that increase the risk to the organization?
Good question. So it was ongoing. So if you can go back, this is all, you can actually go read this if you're interested in it. There's a congressional investigation report that came out about a year after Snowden happened. And I found that in the investigation, Snowden had begun downloading data in the summer of 2012. So about a year before he fled. But he had been planning it for much longer. In fact, some of the books I've read suggest that he began getting disenfranchised and being concerned during his time in Switzerland and Japan when he was with the CIA about 4 or 5 years earlier. And there's also some evidence out there that, well, we know that he was engaged with the group Anonymous, if you're familiar with Anonymous, online, as early as 2004 is what we believe. The evidence isn't super strong in this regard, but I think that there's a claim to be made that he could have been very heavily influenced by folks within that group to do what he did. So it was definitely something planned and something that was ongoing. It wasn't a waking up one morning or, and being pissed off and saying, I'm going to do this and then plan it over a 3-month period or something.
Okay. And Candy asked, I don't know if you know this, but is all the information Snowden took, has it been released?
No.
And is Russia now in control of all that information?
Great question. So this is one thing that really frustrates me as well. So yeah, so to answer the first part of your question, no, not all the information has been released. So most of the information, in fact, has not, is my understanding. And so what Snowden claims to have done is that he claimed to have made multiple copies and put these in different spots across the internet to secure them in case he got offed or arrested or whatever, in which case with instructions that it should be all released and to do damage, right? Kind of like a little ransom, holding the data ransom. But what he claims is that he didn't keep any copy for himself and he no longer had access and he just gave it all to the media. And the media would then go and they'd pick and choose what they wanted. So most of the stuff was probably not very interesting to them because he kind of did a bulk download of information. So the media sifted through it and then chose what they wanted to publish. So no, not everything was released. But let's go to the Russia question, which I think is fascinating. I consider Snowden today an agent of a foreign power. Is questionable, right? And there's scant evidence that he was possible, but not very much evidence for it. But in my mind, the fact that Edward has been in Russia for the last, 8 years now, and been protected by the Russian government suggests to me that the only rational explanation, the only logical explanation I can get for it is that he had to have given that information as his price of admission, right? So what I do is kind of flip the script when I get argued about with this, which is if a Russian intelligence analyst from the FSB, formerly the KGB, but the FSB, showed up in Washington, D.C. with 1.7 million top secret classified documents about how the Russian military, government, and everything works, the CIA is not going to put him up in a house in Boise, Idaho and say, have a good life. You're welcome to stay just so you stick it in the eye of Putin, right? It's like, no, we'll protect you and we'll give you asylum, but your cost of admission is all the data that you took, right? And if you're not going to play ball and you're not going to cooperate with that, then we'll happily send you back, and that sort of thing, right? So I don't see any scenario by which Snowden hasn't been fully engaged with Russian intelligence in the years he's been there, and not given him all the information that they had. In fact, I find it highly suspicious, and this is pure speculation. I want to be clear on that. I do find it highly suspicious that about a year and a half after Snowden ended up in Moscow, Russia started changing the way they approached the United States, ranging from media manipulation. They started hacking our political parties. You had all those sorts of things, right? I wonder, it's purely speculation, but I wonder if after a year and a half of time to sift through all that information, it gave them new insights and new approaches from, hey, maybe this is how we can conduct intelligence operations against the Americans. Again, it's pure speculation, but it seems coincidental. It seems a little more than coincidental to me that Russia kind of changed the way they approached us about a year and a half after Snowden arrived there. But again, that's just speculation. So don't put that in the news.
Jayla Anderson asked, could you speak on your thoughts with regarding recent cybersecurity threats and Facebook and their recent outage?
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, so the Facebook outage to me is highly suspicious. I don't know that I've seen any good evidence that it was a hack, but I'd be surprised if it wasn't. In terms, if you say there were data breaches, they're talking about the outage like when Instagram and Facebook went offline for like 6 hours. If that's what you're referring to, I don't know that I've seen evidence that it was a hack, but that seems to be the most likely. Hackers have gone wild since COVID. They have really taken advantage of it, especially the phishing. Ransomware has really upped its game. And the reason for that is that organizations they see an opportunity, right? So with phishing, people are freaking out and panicking in 2020 about COVID. They're gobbling up any bit of information they can get. So when they get an email in that says, hey, how does COVID affect your financial security? People are more likely to click that email than they would have 6 months previous about just a general email, right? So hackers started attacking that weakness within the human psyche of seeking information. The other things that hackers started doing is because organizations had to go remote work very, very quickly. They had to spin up new VPNs, remote work technologies, laptops, etc. It was all about the CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Confidentiality and even integrity kind of took a back seat in early part of 2020, and it all became availability. We have got to get people up and running. They've got to get working, and then security starts coming later. And so what it did is it opened up a bunch of holes within networks and a lot of things that even companies today were still trying to figure out. How do I adequately balance my security between my vast work at home workforce and people working on site, and the hybrid, which I think scares a lot of people. I have to have people that can both access the network on site and access it from home and access it from around the world. And how do I make sure that all of this is encapsulated, right? So to me, hackers have really taken an advantage of the current crisis through COVID, and it's done a lot of harm and things that we need to be very vigilant against.
Absolutely. So Creighton asked, we often hear training being a solution to cyber and cyber events. What about culture? How do businesses today support culture and the idea of healthy hygiene in digital work? With said healthy culture, how do business managers calculate a return on investment, which is, what every business has to do for critical analysis? I mean, people and that kind of engagement costs money, right?
That's right. That is an excellent question. Let's start with the return on investment piece. That's something we all ask ourselves, right? Like when I was a CISO and I was running in a security team, how do I show that return on investment? Or as a consultant, how do I help companies figure out how to do a return on investment? And it's a very difficult thing. I mean, metrics is the easiest way to do it, right? If you can figure out behavioral analytics and get metrics that are trending over time, and you can start measuring how many small. When I say incidents, I don't mean like huge, large data breaches, but how many security incidents are we having per month, per week, and what are the source of those? And start tracking those. And if you can show that as you've invested more money, that the number of people clicking on phishing emails has decreased, or the number of computers that have gotten some sort of malware on it have decreased, or the amount of data that we believe we've lost through inadvertent uploads to Dropbox or whatever has decreased, right? Those sorts of things can begin to help show that return on investment. So there's a variety of ways to look at it from that regard. The culture element is a really important one. I think training is fairly easy, at least especially from phishing, it's fairly easy to demonstrate a decrease in risk, right? If you're doing those kind of fake phishing tests and you can measure click rates and all of that, you can get pretty good metrics on how training can happen. And reality is I am a big proponent of training because I think you decrease your risk substantially because of that. But culture, to me, culture is important, particularly around insider threats. People, again, like I mentioned in the presentation, a good, healthy culture suggests that you're going to have a less likelihood of somebody getting disgruntled and pissed off and doing malicious harm to the organization. But what a good, healthy culture does as well, where if you can balance security awareness, help people understand how important it is to secure their data, but also make it one where they don't feel like they're being spied on, and they're not being spied on, and their privacy isn't being violated. If you can find that balance, people are going to appreciate security without any sort of resentment towards it, I guess, right? And they're going to be more apt to use better judgment in their actions and their workflows and all that. And I'd also argue that, and this probably needs to be a study done on this, but that a healthy culture at work and people enjoying their company and their workspace probably, I would assume, and I think there have been some studies done on this, increases productivity and work especially from home, right? Like if you enjoy the work you're doing, you got a good culture, you're engaged with people, even if you're working from home, you're probably gonna be a little bit more productive. So I think culture goes a long way to doing that. I think those organizations that ignore culture do shoot themselves in the foot. And I'd also add one more thing, is that finding talent this right now is very, very hard, no matter what field you're in. If you have a crappy culture and it sucks to work there, we're going to leave. We're going to go find a new job, and you're going to have a hard time finding anybody that's any decent. So
that's true. As a cybersecurity recruiter, I can promise you that is true.
Yeah, for sure.
That's right.
So we also got a question from Steve Pack. A lot of non-governmental entities, regular companies, quote unquote, such as Google, IBM, handle sensitive emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, et cetera, nowadays, but they can't enforce strict screening mechanisms as government entities would do, right?
Right.
So what could they do alternatively?
So I think there's a few things you can do. One, I think there are things companies can do to screen the employees they're putting on those programs more thoroughly than they do. I think the reason they don't do it is more because of money and resources and a willingness to do it than it is because of a lack of ability to do it. I do think maybe they can't go do the full, thorough background check. If you've gone through the whole SF-86 process with the government, and they scan you up and down and look at all facets of your life, you may not be able to go into that level of depth, right? But you don't necessarily need to. But I think there is more that can be done. They just choose not to because of money. So I think that's an element of it. The other thing I would say is that if some of the technologies that Google works on and these tech companies work on are often a public-private engagement, and so the government will come in, and there are some higher security requirements placed upon them, particularly if it's viewed as critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure isn't just water and electricity and transportation, it's also technology falls within that. And so some of those companies have those requirements as well. But I would say one of the ways in which I probably approach security is just kind of standard, strong security hygiene, right? At Google, you don't need the entire company secured at the same level, right? Just like at NSA, you've got the HR folks and the public affairs folks can do work at the agency that don't have the same level of necessarily cybersecurity requirements as a highly compartmented classified project may have, where they've got 5 people right into it. Organizations can treat it the same way. So I would suggest that organizations like Google and could be HP or Boeing or whatever they are, for these really highly sensitive projects, can treat those projects with the same level of scrutiny and security that the NSA treats their top secret environment. You can have a building that is very, very secure, that very few people have access to. And you can do physical access controls and logical access controls. You can isolate, you can create a network, like a isolated network that is disconnected, like an air gap network to do a lot of the work on with limited connectivity with the global network to decrease the likelihood it's going to get hacked. So there's a lot of technology things you can do to help protect that. And then it's very strong. I would, again, go back to culture and training. I think that's a very important thing. And if you can, I know this is kind of cliche a little bit, but if you can convince and especially those companies where they're really doing important things, if you can help your people understand how important is what they're doing.
Stephen froze on us.
What value it is, not just to the company. I don't know if my company came to me and said the share price, I don't care. What was that? Oh, I don't like, for me, I don't care about the share. I could care less about what my share price is, right? I'm going to care more about that I'm doing a good job, that the work I do adds value to organizations, to my customers, et cetera. So if you can convey why it's important and why it's valuable beyond just making the boss rich, I think that you're going to be able to help build that healthy culture as well.
Absolutely. Solomon Israel asked another question. A number of companies have moved to bring your own device to reduce costs. Given the thumb drive example you've highlighted, do you see a reasonable way to protect corporate information assets while also supporting BYOD?
Yeah, there are. Again, this goes back to what level of intrusion do you want to have on your customer, on your employees. So it really kind of depends on how critical is the data that you're processing, right? I would argue that we probably overclassify data to some extent, both in the government and in private companies. But yeah, there's BYOD technologies that you're probably familiar with that you can install, a mobile iron and such that you can install on your phones, on your tablets, laptops. Endpoint detection response like CrowdStrike, et cetera, can provide a measure of the security as well. You can put on full disk encryption on your laptops and on your devices. So there's a variety of ways to secure and lock down those devices. The hard part is when the easiest way to do it, even though can be a little more costly, is to issue everybody company laptops, phones, technology. But if you're like me as an employee, my company gave me a cell phone, but it was optional to use it. So I installed everything on my personal phone, so I don't want to carry two phones around, right? So but I'm careful about how I use my phone for various, they have certain apps I only use for work and certain apps that I only use for personal. I keep those things kind of separate. But depending on the level of security you want, you can mandate that, yeah, we need to have, you have to have a work phone. It has to have mobile iron on it. And I have been part of a company in the past that I worked for that required me to install mobile iron on my personal cell phone, which I was okay with at the time, but I probably wouldn't be today. I think that it kind of goes back to the whole privacy thing, right? It's my paying for it. Unless you want to buy me a phone, you pay for it, right? But then you can. But if I'm paying for it, you're not going to install your technology on there. But I know back then I had 3 or 4 guys that worked for me that absolutely refused, and HR tried to get on their case about it. And they're like, look, if you want me to work on my phone, you're welcome to buy me one and I'll use that. But I'm not putting your technology on my phone. I'm just not going to do it. So.
Fair enough. And Jackson had brought up something earlier when we were just talking amongst ourselves regarding a quote that we'd heard. I can't remember if it was, I think it was somebody from Capitol Hill back when Snowden left the country, about Americans not caring as much about freedom as they do security, personal privacy versus security. What do you think about that?
I think there's a subset of society that does, right? I mean, freedom, I think if you look, you could take, and I won't dive into this too much because it's a very hot topic. The vaccine is a perfect example, right? I think we're seeing that. It's just like what we saw with Snowden, right? There's an element of personal, there's a faction of society that values liberty, freedom, and everything more than security, right? So until you get to the extremes, security and freedom are diametrically opposed. I would argue that if you get too free, you then lose security, and or you get or too secure, you then lose. That doesn't always the case, right? You lose some stuff, but in the middle, they're diametrically opposed. So the more free you are, the less secure you are, and the more secure you are, the less free you are. And then to me, that's the crux of the vaccine argument. That is, there's a lot of people that say, look, I don't mind you getting the vaccine, but you're not going to force me to do it. And your security concerns are not mine. I care far more about my personal liberties and all that. And then you have another faction that's like, look, the good of society, the good of of the health of the public, and we got to stop this thing, and our security is more important than maintaining whatever sort of violation of your civil liberties that you think may be occurring, right? So that's kind of and I'm not making a judgment one way or the other. I'm just saying that's kind of how what we're seeing today. And so I don't know that most people want security over freedom. I think that is I think there's an element of a human natural trait that I think if you were to measure it globally would probably be that way. But there does seem to be something, at least in the American psyche, that I can tell, that where we're very independent and we're very much like kind of building off of kind of what the founding principles of the country were, which was personal freedom and liberty and all that. I think that's really been built into our psyche pretty heavy. And that's a hard thing to let go of. So I don't know that it's as true for Americans as it might be in countries where they haven't had that sort of multi-generational, I'm going to use indoctrination, but not in a bad way, but necessarily, but thing. So that's probably a little more philosophical than I probably should have gotten into, but that's my thinking on it.
No. Well, Stephen, I think we're probably at the end of our Q&A, but we are going to move on to our session of being able to network online. I also want to thank you so much, and Kudelski Security for allowing you to talk with us here. And thank you, Jackson, for setting everything up and asking great questions. Let's see, I think Shannon was asking, how may AT&T employees sign up as Tech Titan members and attend Tech Tuesday events free of charge? I really can't answer that. Somebody else is going to have to jump in that. But I do believe that AT&T has a corporate membership to Tech Titans. And so all you have to do is log in as an AT&T employee, and you should be able to set up your own account. No, Jackson's saying no. Okay, Jackson, how do they do it?
That's a question for Shannon to answer.
Pardon?
Hi. Well, no, it's pretty similar to that. What you need to do is at least contact me or somebody at Tech Titan so that we can send you an invitation to create a login ID. And then the rest is easy. You just sign up for everything that you're interested in at that point. But you do need a login ID that will come from a Tech Titan staff member. But to the point that Marty was making, that all employees of a company that have a membership in Tech Titan are considered members, so they can enjoy the benefits of programs like this, the tech industry luncheon, although there's a cost to attend that, the golf tournament, the gala, all that at member rates. And that's a little known fact, particularly with larger companies that may not be well aware of. So yeah, anybody who works for a member company is certainly welcome to create that login with Shannon or others on Tech Titan's staff, and we'll get you set up.
And Tech Titans does have one more event this week. It's this Friday, the 19th. It's the Tech Industry Luncheon. And the speaker is going to be Gertrude Van Horn. She's the CIO of NCH Corp, headquartered here in Irving. And the topic is, what have you done for me lately? The changing landscape of the CIO role. And I have heard Gertrude speak on many occasions, and she's a great speaker, very engaging, very entertaining, almost as engaging as Steve, but not quite. So we hope you'll join us there. There's still an opportunity to sign up for that as well. And I'll be there, certainly, with bells on. Love to see you guys face to face. All right, so Shannon, are we gonna flip over to the networking side of this now, or?
Yes, the networking is going to stay here as it is. Everybody is free to talk as they wish among yourselves.
And would you like to stop the recording now?
Yes, I'm doing that too.